along with obviously our featured author, Kathy Harms, and her wonderful father, Walter. So let's just give them a nice warm welcome with a speech.
Hi, good evening, folks. Thanks so much for coming in on this gorgeous. Oh, somebody's joining us.
Perfect. In the nick of time. Well,
come on in. And just one other small housekeeping. Feel free to grab a seat anywhere. There is tea and water if you're feeling like you would like to have some refreshment. Okay, so I'm Susan, and I'm here to act as your moderator with our author Kathy and her father Walter. Thank you all for being here this evening, and we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'm grateful to acknowledge, respect, and honor the First Nations upon whose traditional territory we are meeting this evening, and all Aboriginal peoples who also reside within these boundaries. So we are going to jump in, and I'm going to give you a formal introduction to Kathy, though I have a feeling that most of you know her personally as well. Kathy is a writer, a photographer, and a storyteller who was born in British Columbia and is currently living in Porto, Portugal, of which I am very envious and can't wait to go visit. I think maybe Dave's had a chance to go for a visit. Before taking on her creative pursuits, Kathy worked as a paramedic in rural BC. She actually underplays this a little bit in her bio. I think she was quite an accomplished paramedic in her field, and in Vancouver, and spent 10 years volunteering with a Canadian NGO, which I believe she also helped to found and run. So again, underplaying it a little bit here. Specializing in medical aid and disaster relief. And disaster relief is what her first novel, Resilience in the Rubble, was based on her experiences there. That is also available here this evening for you to purchase and have the author sign. Tonight, Kathy is presenting By Happenstance, and this is the story of Kathy's parents, Walter and Tricia, and it is told as a two-part story that meets in the middle. Perfect. Samara's just putting the book up so you can see that it's actually two books in one. And we are joined with this evening with Walter, whose story is the first part of the book.
Oh, I thought it was the second part.
Oh, wow. See, elders first, you know? Age before beauty, isn't that what they say? And so we're going to go ahead and have Kathy begin her readings. I think that you've changed. I didn't address that in my notes. Okay, great.
I'll introduce them.
So Kathy's going to go ahead and read a couple of excerpts from us. Then we'll have, I have a few prepared questions, and then we'll have time for you all to also ask some questions as well. So I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Great. So the reason we did a book with two front covers is so you don't have to choose a favorite parent. But I still have to choose one to read first. So I'm going to first read to you from my mom's story, Tricia. And the section I'm going to read for you occurs in 1959, in the fall of 1959, in Liverpool, England. And Tricia was a few months into her nurse's training at Alderhay Children's Hospital. And she had started that rotation with a case of laryngitis, so that will make sense during the reading. After her initial study block, Tricia began her first ward rotation, 3 months on the ear, nose, and throat ward. She spent her first week on day shifts, cleaning and observing while her voice recovered. During the day, patients were admitted, many were awaiting surgery. New arrivals were immediately checked for nits or head lice, a task considered the lowliest on the ward and usually assigned to the most junior student nurse. When it was Tricia's job, she ended the morning with white, wrinkled hands as the metal nit combs were carried from patient to patient in a solution of carbolic to keep them disinfected. The children called the students who checked for nits Nitty Nora, the bug explorer, the nickname passed down through generations of patients. Tricia took no offense. Small jokes like that helped lighten the mood. Night shifts were another matter entirely. On her first night shift, Tricia discovered that the ward became a completely different world after dark. During the day, she was the most junior person, shielded by layers of supervision. At night, she was alone on the ward with a single nurse's aide. She arrived at 8 p.m. and was met by the day sister, who briskly delivered a report for each patient. The information came quickly, without pause for questions. Tricia stood in a fog, her heart pounding. When the sister finished, she turned to leave. Tricia stepped forward to hold the door open. "Good night, sister." And suddenly, she was in charge of 36 children. Tricia was 18 years old, only months into her training, standing in a dimly lit ward in an unfamiliar world. By day, the ward was lively. By night, it was tense. Post-operative children were uncomfortable, younger ones frightened and crying, missing their parents. Even those awaiting surgery watched anxiously, and fear spread through the ward. It wasn't such an interesting adventure once the sun had set. A night sister oversaw several wards and would make rounds every 2 hours. She could be called on in the case of an emergency, though Tricia wasn't entirely sure what qualified as one. Everything felt like a crisis. She squared her shoulders and began working with the aide, checking dressings for signs of bleeding, assisting with toilets and bedpans. TPR, temperature, pulse, and respirations, had to be taken and recorded every 4 hours in the TPR book, and Tricia remembered she should check to see when the last set had been recorded. Between tasks, she tried to remember names, each child's diagnosis and medication schedule. Her mind raced. How on earth would she manage all of this? Partway through the shift, the ward doors swung open and a man walked in. Visiting hours had been over for some time. Tricia felt a small surge of relief. Finally, something she knew how to deal with. She straightened, smoothed her apron, and strode forward with an importance well beyond her first-year student standing. She was in charge now. Remembering just in time to always be polite, she addressed him firmly. "I'm sorry, sir, but visiting time is over. You must come back tomorrow." The man looked momentarily surprised, then nodded and complied without argument. Tricia watched him go, feeling quietly triumphant. She returned to her duties with a renewed sense of confidence. Later, she stepped away for her official coffee break, a brisk 15-minute trip to the dining room. When she returned to the ward, the sight that greeted her stopped her cold. The night sister stood at a bedside. Beside her was the same man. Tricia froze. He was not a parent. He was not a visitor. He was the ENT consultant. Her heart thumped in her chest. Had she just thrown a consultant out of his own ward? As she approached, bracing herself for the inevitable reckoning, the consultant spoke first. "Now, sister, don't be cross," he said lightly. "She was only doing her job. My wife always tells me I look like the gardener." Relief washed over Tricia so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. The night sister offered a thin smile, then turned to Tricia. "Back to work." And that was that. The rest of the night passed in a blur of near calamities. By morning, Tricia decided the sole advantage of night shifts was that she had not been called Nitty Nora even once. So now we'll read a section from Dad's story, Walter's story. And this takes place in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories in summer 1971. At the time, Dad was flying for a man named Bob Gauthier, who founded Buffalo Airways. You may have heard of them. They're still around under different ownership. I think that's all the setup we need for that. From the time of his first flying lesson in 1965, Walter had been keenly interested in everything to do with aviation, especially its history. One evening, as he returned to the base, his attention was caught by a conversation among a few of the guys. They had heard that a group of old-time bush pilots had chartered a DC-6 from Pacific Western and were planning a nostalgic tour of the North. They were the first generation of bush pilots. Pioneers who wanted to revisit some of the places central to the early evolution of northern flying. Fort Smith was on their itinerary, and they would be overnighting there. Walter's colleagues began discussing how they might honor the old-timers when they arrived in a few days' time. Someone suggested a flyover in formation, and the idea quickly gained momentum. They recruited pilots from Gateway and shared their vision. Everyone was eager to take part. There was no shortage of volunteers. Soon the finer details of the plan began to emerge. They would fly a double echelon formation using the bush planes they had on hand, and with Walter flying lead in the Beaver. When the DC-6 arrived carrying the old-timers, the local pilots were ready. Walter in the Beaver, Joe in the Aztec, Kevin in the 206, and others flying Beavers, an Otter, and a couple of Cessnas. They coordinated with the radio operators so that once the DC-6 landed and the visiting pilots were walking across the tarmac towards the terminal, the local crew would make their pass overhead. When the operator gave the word, Walter moved into position, and the others fanned out behind him, forming up in the air. He had to concentrate, managing his speed to make sure he kept ahead of the faster planes. It might not have been a perfect formation, but it was good, and it was a fitting display of respect. It moved the old-timers they were honoring as well. Since Walter's Beaver was on float, as were most of the other aircraft, the guys broke formation after the flyover. Most headed to Instant Lake to land, and the others returned to the airstrip. By the time Walter and the other float planes had landed and returned to the dock, the radio operator had already passed along an invitation from the old-timers to join them at the Legion for a meet and greet. The Legion had prepared a dinner for the visiting pilots, and the local crew were invited to join. It was a great evening, filled with stories, laughter, and a sense of shared history among men who had staked their lives on flying in the North. Walter listened to tales from pioneers who had flown the earliest aircraft, the Belenkas, the Junkers, and the Fairchilds, rickety machines from another era. Some even spoke of flying open cockpit airplanes. That caught his attention. The North was bitterly cold, a place where a guy really, really wanted a windshield. Those guys were tough in a way that amazed him. At one point, one of the old-timers said, "You know, you guys are the next generation. You have the airplanes that can do all the things we wished we could have done, but we couldn't." Walter was moved by that comment. He felt proud his generation was accomplishing more than the first could have imagined, yet humbled knowing that it was only possible because of the advances in equipment. What those early bush pilots had achieved was remarkable, but so too was what pilots in the 1970s could do now with aircraft like the Beaver and the Otter, machines designed for rugged northern flying. Walter went to sleep that night, still in awe of having met the man who pioneered flight in the North. That summer, another pilot joined the Buffalo team, a man named Fred Cunningham. He and Walter hit it off immediately. Fred worked as a high school teacher in Fort Smith during the winter, then flew for the summer season. For the first 3 weeks of July, Fred flew with Walter in the Otter most days. They hauled cargo that required two guys to load and unload, and through the long hours and shared work, they became close friends. A few weeks later, Fred had a mishap of his own, this time in the 185. He had flown it up to Snowdrift, the small community on the shore of Great Slave Lake. Walter was working in the area and also made a landing that morning at Snowdrift. When he taxied to the dock, he was surprised to find Fred standing there, but no aircraft. "Where's your plane?" Walter asked. Fred pointed across the bay. "It's over there, tits up," he said. He explained that he'd been taking off into the wind when one of the floats caught a wave awkwardly, pivoting the plane 180 degrees. He was still under takeoff power, but now with the wind pushing him from behind. A larger wave caught the 185 and somersaulted it over into the water. A couple of local men on the dock had been watching. By the time Fred scrambled out of the cockpit and climbed onto the exposed belly of the aircraft, they were already on their way with a boat to pick him up. Walter taxied in the direction Fred indicated, and sure enough, there was the 185 upside down in the water. It had drifted as far as it could, and it was scraping against the cliff with each swell. There was nothing they could do in that weather, so they returned to Fort Smith. Bob didn't have much to say about the incident. In the weeks that followed, he arranged to have the 185 salvaged and eventually sold it to someone planning to rebuild it. Walter knew Bob demanded a great deal from his pilots, but he also had their backs when things went wrong. Even experienced pilots could run into trouble, as Bob well knew. He made sure the equipment was in top condition, and Walter appreciated that the rules were clear with Bob, even if they were bent once in a while.
the insight I found when I read it, both of the Tricia's piece and Walter's piece, it provoked just so many more questions for me. As I was reading them around, well, how did that come to be? An 18-year-old is looking after 30 kids all alone. You know, and Walter and I were chatting earlier about one of my favorite lines in the book is when you're taking the government people out to take a look at something and flying home, trying to urge them to get in the plane because we gotta go, and then sort of flying a little bit under the radar with regards to the regulations, and the government person makes a comment after they come in safely to Walter saying, I think maybe you've done that before. And Walter choosing not to respond.
The statute of limitations is up on all of this. It's fine.
Yeah.
It was actually completely illegal.
There we go, and we have it recorded.
Yeah.
I feel like Dave now has some leverage. So I'd like to maybe take us back a little bit to Kathy's process and how this came to be, and then we can have some questions from you if you have questions specific to the stories or the process and how we got here this evening. So can you give us a little bit of an idea around how this started to come together?
Sure. About 2 years ago, I live in Portugal now, so when I come home, I'm not coming home for a weekend anymore. They're saddled with me for a few months. And so there's more time, and I need a project when there's time. And so 2 years ago, before I arrived, I messaged my mom and I asked if I could ask her a few questions about her nursing career, thinking maybe I could write an essay or something. So Mom started telling stories from her years of nursing, and then, you know, memory works in interesting ways, and it's not always linear. So there's stories about nursing, and then, you know, from childhood, and then back and forth. And before I left and went back to Porto, I had a lot of notes and a timeline, and we'd gone through photos and, you know, mapped them to stories and what have you. And so we realized we had much more than an essay. And so I started writing, and I would write a chapter, send it to Mom. She would edit and give direction, let's say, and send it back, and we would carry on that way. And even when we were in that process of starting at the beginning and trying to move through to the end, memories keep coming up. And even, you know, this week, you know, there's new things, and it's like, well, that would have been nice to include, but it's only just come up now because of thinking about it and whatnot. So when we finished Mums, we started Dad's, and it was kind of similar. Just asking, you know, what do you remember? And then filling in gaps. Going to my cousin Christine, who's here, she had family photos and documents, as well when she was it high school or college that you interviewed Omanopa?
That was when I was in university.
Yeah, in university. She'd interviewed her grandparents, and so they told the story of their time in Canada through their own words, with dates and locations and little descriptions of houses and things. And so that kind of became the backbone of the timeline. And then my Aunt Gerda, Dad's sister, Chris's mom, she had more photos. She has a sharp memory for those early years, so she corrected us on a few things.
I'm not sure she was 100% right though.
She's not sure you're 100% right. So.
You can take it up with her and Duke and I'm not.
Yeah. So we have some version of the truth in here based on everyone's memories. And so we just started, again, the same thing, plotting the stories on a timeline and filling in gaps where we could. And through all of that, I kept telling Dad, man, I wish you still had your pilot logbooks. And he says, well, you know, they're here somewhere, but he couldn't find them. And we were well into it when you found them, and what a gift that was. As every flight that he took, from his training flights to his last flight, are logged, so we could fix the timeline in grand ways. And then it also prompted memories of some other stories as well.
Yes.
And even with that process, Dad had photos of him loading teams of sled dogs into a plane, and I thought that was pretty amazing. And it's told about in here, But then I was talking to Aunt Gerda, and she says, you know, I don't know that many stories about your dad's flying days, just the one where he transported the wolf. And I'm like, come again? So I asked Dad about it, and he's like, oh yeah. So that's in here too. So it's funny how memory is prompted by other memories, and it comes out very organically. Yeah.
And so Walter, when Kathy was first starting this, and she started with Tricia, and then I think you were noticing and getting intrigued, and tell us a little bit about how that happened for you.
Yeah, but I wasn't that excited about it at first
Okay.
because, like I told you, a lot of the stuff that was more noteworthy was also legal. So we never talked about
Yes.
anything in the trade. You know, while I was working, I didn't ever tell Bob, my boss, how the flight went. Just that here's the charter ticket, you know, with Meta I concluded it, and that was it. And he never asked because he also knew, because I don't know if you know his story, but he got lost on a flight from Cambridge Bay to Yellowknife and spent 58 days on a frozen lake one winter. But he was a super guy. I mean, but that was a real epic survival story. And he was aware that stuff like that happened. So when we had issues, I mean, he would send us on some pretty hairy trips. But if you wanted to quit and turn around, you could. But he was the kind of guy you sort of wanted to please. And so sometimes you let that desire override your common sense. And, there were trips that were very marginal.
So now that, because it's been mentioned a few times this evening, and we chuckle about it, but I think there's a truth in it. The statute of limitations has run out.
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
And so you can share these stories. And so what was important for you in kind of sharing these and having this with Kathy?
It was a part of my life that had faded more or less into the background. And because it was treated with silence at the time, it didn't imprint on your memory as well as if you would have been telling the story to others. But the other, you know, the passengers on the airplane retold the stories, but the pilots never did. And none of them. I mean, none of them talked about what they did, which was it was sort of interesting. And there was a perception amongst the public, you know, that we were a bunch of adrenaline junkies, and that wasn't really the case. I don't know if you included the one where I picked those kids up, where I tipped out in the canoe. Okay, anyway, I was flying out of Terrace. That was my last posting, and I had some big shots from Yurkan or Alcan or one of those outfits, and we went down to the dock, and I could hear someone.
Oh.
Can you just talk a little louder?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
We heard these kid voices out on the lake yelling help, and it was rough. And there were no boats on the lake because it was too rough for that. And I said to my passengers, because they were paying for it after all, I said, "Do you want to go and pick those kids up?" And of course, they said yes, because I expected them to. And then I taxied out there, and there were two little guys in the water with an upturned canoe, and the guy, the passenger that had been the most interested, jumped out on the float, which I hoped he would do, because I was not supposed to leave the controls when you have passengers in the airplane, and all that kind of stuff. And I said, get the little guy first, but the big guy pushed the canoe away from the airplane and grabbed the float. So he pulled him aboard, and then I had to reposition to get the other kid. Anyway, we got to the dock, and there was a group of adults standing there, and these soaking wet kids. And one of the people came over to me, and the only thing she said was, "Why didn't you bring the canoe?"
Oh my goodness!
Because I guess I had fallen short.
Oh.
Because we did carry canoes on the airplane, but it was a bit of a job. Time went on, you know, and I had passengers. I mean, they were paying, so they got the first dibs. But it's one of those things. I never said anything because I always find it hard to think of anything edifying to say at moments like that. But that was sort of the expectation that the public had, you know, that we could do all this kind of stuff in no time at all. And that's not true. Like, we actually did try to survive, and we had a mental process called a risk-reward assessment that we did for every trip. Then you don't talk about, but you just think it through, you know, like how big is the risk and how big is the reward for doing this trip. And that part of the trade was probably unknown by most of the public. And I'm here, an old man today.
There is that saying about bush pilots. Aren't there some saying about
There's
they die
yeah,
young? There's good
well-
ones or dead ones or something?
oh.
Yeah.
The one I've heard is
Okay.
that there's bold bush pilots and old bush pilots, but there's very few old,
Right.
bold bush pilots.
Yeah.
Yeah, it had a way of thinning out the crowd, like it's because there were risks involved, but they weren't really that horrendous. I mean, you could mitigate most of it, but sometimes you were in a situation where you had to do something that was a bit on the edge.
So as you were going through this process with Kathy, were you surprised by anything that came up for you?
Well, I was surprised at some of the memories, and when my sister remembered the wolf, you know, that, oh yeah, I remember that. And at the time, it was a bit traumatic because I picked up a trapper who he had a really good team of dogs, and I think he drove the dogs into Fort Smith, and then I went back and got him and his bales of fur, and he was very successful. And he had a wolf that he had live trapped, and he wanted to use it for breeding with his dogs to improve their stamina. And he said, I've been working with it. And I said, "Well, okay." So he dragged it onto the airplane, he had it on a rope, and we loaded the bales of fur a foot or so away from the rear bulkhead, and he dropped the wolf into there. And he figured that would do the trick, but wolves are fairly athletic, and it managed to get out of there and came scrambling to the front. And I was flying the airplane, and the guy was beside me, and he was on his knees on the seat trying to push it back. You can drag a wolf with a rope, but you can't push him. And so it was pretty tense. He got his hand chewed up a little bit and stuff like that. Well, I mean, it was a wolf, and you know, full-grown one. So anyway, that was I created a bit of artificial turbulence, and we got him back into the rest of the trip went okay.
Was that also a surprise for you to watch how memory was provoking memory and how that process was happening?
Yeah, kind of, because there were stories from both Mom and Dad that we'd heard many times. You know, they were kind of the highlight reel stories, and so those ones came first. But then you start asking questions about things that happened before, things that happened after. You ask about a particular date, maybe. And then that's when you start to kind of get all the connective tissue of those highlight reels. You know, it's like, oh, now I'm starting to understand why you made that decision in this one story that we know quite well. Now we see how it built, you know, how life experiences led you to that point. So there was, there was a lot to learn going through that.
Yeah, it was a challenge to remember. I still have things coming to mind now that we didn't get in the book, because it's not comprehensive. Neither should it be, because it would get pretty boring to hear the whole thing. But
was there, as you were working together on this, was there a new insight that you had into? I'm gonna ask Walter first. Is there a new insight that you had into Kathy, into your daughter? as
Well,
you
I
were
did.
doing
I
this?
mean, when you raise a child, you don't have any idea how they're going to turn out. And you know, and Kathy, she didn't completely exceed my expectation, because I remember once when
There's room to go.
she was maybe 4 years old, and
Oh, great.
we had a little farm, and
She inherited your sense of humor. Yeah.
what's that?
She inherited your sense of humor.
Yeah. Anyway, I came home from work one day, and she met me at the door, and she says, "Dad, I need a job." And we had a couple of dozen laying hens, so I thought about it for a bit, and I said, "Well, you take care of the chickens, and then you can sell the eggs, and that'll be your income." And she took it seriously. I mean, a couple of times a day she'd be out there and did it, and opened a bank account, and when she went to school she could buy her own stuff. She was economically independent, so I wasn't totally surprised that she succeeded in life. But still, I hadn't thought of her as an author, and well, who does? I mean, I have
Well, neither had she.
I mean, I don't write anything. I mean, not even a shopping list. I try to remember it, and that's so that was, and then I learned something new in my old age, because we use Zoom for interviews. Well, yeah, I took early retirement to avoid getting roped into the computer world, and it never happened. Yeah.
I appreciated using the Zoom though, because now we have Dad's story, you know, the things that I captured in here, but we also have him telling his stories on video, so that's nice too.
So you recorded that.
Yeah.
Great. And so was there, as you were sort of filling out, you know, as you said, the connective tissue, I love that idea there. Was there anything that surprised you that you were not expecting to uncover?
Well, I didn't know much about Dad's childhood, actually. I knew about the flying. I knew that you'd briefly been a teacher, but I didn't really know how it all came to be. So I learned a ton about your childhood and your teenage years and your first jobs and all of that. Yeah.
I have to say, when I read, and I really appreciate for both of those stories, you actually get a fair amount of background on Walter and Tricia's parents as well, which is very interesting, and to understand that and how people moved to Canada and what that really looked like, and then understanding what it was like as you were settling in the interior and clearing the land, and building the house, and single-handedly. I mean, we hear the stories, but it's very different to like sit across from a person who lived that life and really feel it in a different way.
Well, the thing about the pioneering years was that every year was better than the year before.
Yeah.
And that makes life good. Like, you don't have to be at the pinnacle, but you're heading that way is better than where you're at the pinnacle heading the other way. And for kids nowadays, you know, they see decline in their standard of life. We always saw improvement every year.
Interesting.
And so I think I lived the best of times. And it made your life was actually good and rewarding.
And when you were writing Tricia's story about coming over from England, what was drawing you to that piece of background about your mom, about her time in Liverpool? And
Well, what was interesting about, I didn't realize that I do things quite a bit like Mom, like a bit on a whim. And so she stumbled in, like, there's a reason this is called By Happenstance, because Mom's career in nursing was a sheer accident, a completely unplanned decision on the spot. Dad fell into flying by seeing a little ad in the newspaper. It wasn't a plan at all. And so, and Mom's decision to come to Canada, she didn't have a plan to come to Canada, but she had a plan to go somewhere. And so when a posting, she found again a little ad in the newspaper, because that's how things were done, for a nursing job in Namu. She'd never heard of it. She applied. Namu. It was a cannery on the west coast. It's no longer in operation. So she got the job, but when she went to get her immigration or her visas and whatnot from the immigration office in Manchester, they couldn't find Namu on the map, so they wouldn't fill out the papers. They're like, we can't send a young lady to a place we can't find on a map. Are you silly? And so they did their research and they found the place, and she got her papers. And that her arrival in Canada, I can't even imagine going from a busy city hospital, training hospital, full of people, to being the sole medical provider in a West Coast fly-in only cannery. Like just the shock of that had to be immense. And so that was, that was surprising.
Did you see any parallels between your mom and your dad, and the way that you're drawn forward in your life to things like going to disaster relief or going to a new country, or
Well, see, like Mom doesn't think things through, neither do I. And then Dad does the risk-reward calculation, and I guess I do a form of that as well. So yeah, I definitely saw similarities with both parents. Yeah.
How is it for you, Walter, having your part of your life story out there in print?
Well, that's actually something that, having lived my whole life in secrecy, having it now exposed is something that I was never prepared for. But nobody's knocked down the door in the middle of the night, so I think I'm okay.
So you've mentioned a couple times, both of you, that more stories are coming up. Do you think you'll try to capture those? Are you drawn now to doing this a bit more?
No, I don't think so.
No?
No, I don't know. I don't think Kathy will write any more about us. She'll find something else to write about now.
Well, you never know.
You never know.
Well, we'll see.
Sounds like there's lots of story left to talk about. So, what would you like people to take away from the process, the content, the learning, the engagement with your family? What would you like people to take away from this book?
Well, I think a few things. So one, it became important to, once we kind of started the process, it became important to really learn and understand more and more about Mom and Dad, because they have really interesting lives, and we want to know more about that. And Mom, she's done genealogy for many years. She's got a very detailed family tree. She's got all the birth certificates and death certificates and census data, and we know where people lived. But as she says, that's all data. Like, we know where they lived, when they lived there, but we don't know who they were, and we don't know how they were. We don't know what they liked. We don't know if they were lovely people or jerks. Like, we don't know any of this. And as Mom was saying last week, this fills in all those gaps. Like, it's more than data, it's actual stories. Yeah. And I think that's really important. And I'm part of a couple of writing groups in Porto, and we meet together and we read and critique each other's work and whatnot. So they've heard excerpts from this, and so many of them say, man, I wish I could have done that. Yeah. And so my question is, how do you get to people who have the opportunity still to do it? And you maybe writing a book is an overachievement. Like, you don't have to do that. You can simply ask the questions. You can, record the answers. You can you can do anything, right? You can describe photographs. You can tell stories around photographs and write them down. Just capturing all those stories, that take it beyond just being data points.
I think the idea of, because I Zoom with my mom as well, or FaceTime, and I think the idea of recording that is brilliant, actually.
With consent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I actually think that's a brilliant idea. something really accessible for most of us to take on.
Well, and not everybody, I say with consent kind of seriously, because Mom
Yeah.
wouldn't let us record her.
Yeah.
And so I had to handwrite notes, and that changes the experience a bit, but it doesn't make it impossible. But it is very important to
Yeah,
make sure you ask.
good reminder. Okay, folks, what questions might you have that,
I'd like to hear a little bit about the romance, because
The
I've been
romance.
married a very long time, Walter and Tricia. And how did you and Tricia meet?
Well, she was the nurse in Telegraph Creek, and I was flying the SCAD out of Terrace, and so
So she was in where first?
Telegraph Creek was her final posting.
Okay.
She worked in a few different communities and ended up there.
Okay.
Yeah, so Mom was the community health nurse in Telegraph Creek, and Telegraph Creek at that time, now there's a road into it, but at that time, it was fly-in only. And so Dad would, and other pilots, but Dad as well, would fly in mail and supplies and fly passengers in and out, and Mom, if she had to send a patient out, she would send it on the SCAD. And so that's how they met.
Are there any other questions? Any other curiosities? Yeah.
How complicated was it, and how did you decide to print it like this? I think it's brilliant. I love it.
Well, thank you. It's actually, I can't take credit for the idea. My stepdaughter suggested it. She had a book of 2 stories that was bound this way.
Okay.
And so when we were thinking about how to present it, she suggested it. I loved the idea. It wasn't, I mean, formatting is never fun. I recommend paying somebody to do it. It'll save your sanity. But it wasn't any worse than doing a regular book. But what's tricky is getting it printed, because so many printing presses now are run by, like, it's AI scanning the files, and they flag it as being incorrect because half of it's upside down. So you need to find a printing press that still uses humans to look at their files. And that's not straightforward. There's not very many of those around. And so that was a complication with it. But yeah, it wasn't any, once you've got the 2 manuscripts, it's just a matter of reordering them, turning them upside down.
And when you read it, do you recommend reading one story and then the other?
No, they're
Or
2 completely
can you read chapter? Can
no.
you read chapter by chapter?
That
Like
would
of
be
your dad's
complicated,
story
but
and
fly
your
at
own
it.
We didn't actually know each other until the final, like when Trish went to Telegraph Creek.
Okay,
And
so the stories don't line up.
No,
No,
they're 2
they-
completely
Okay.
separate
Okay.
stories.
Yeah.
They're available as 2 separate ebooks as well.
Okay.
I couldn't think of a clever way to combine the ebooks, so they're 2 separate ones.
Okay.
Because there's also, going to be 2 different audiences for this. Like, there's a lot of bush pilots who are excited to read about dads, and a lot of nurses who are excited to read about moms. So the ebooks are separate. Yeah.
Do you have a writing project in mind?
I have a writing project I'm just completing, and I'm reviewing my manuscript, and I can't imagine reviewing a PDF that's half upside down.
Right.
So
Well,
that's why I was
You review it
curious.
first, and then you put it upside
Yes.
down. Yeah. That's a pro tip.
It's hard enough as it is.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have a question?
How long did it take you to write that, Trish?
Well, we did the first interviews with Mom this time 2 years ago. So it took roughly a year to do mums and a year to do dads, I'd say. Because I have a Substack, and I always need a ton of external accountability. So each chapter, we would write it, review it, I would post the rough draft on Substack. And that was kind of where we learned that there was an audience for this, because initially we sort of thought it was just for family, but when I posted the chapter 1 of Mums, it had 300 readers in the first day. And people were contacting and saying, my mom was born during the war, and my grandparents had an Anderson shelter in their backyard, and my mom didn't meet her father for 4 years either. And so it was very I think it spoke to a lot of different families. And we had a good following all the way through for both stories. So that was good encouragement as well. And then I also had a schedule. I had to write a chapter every 2 weeks. Because, you know, you say you're gonna post it, you gotta do it, so it was a good accountability device.
Is your Substack your name? Or the book's name?
Yeah, if you Google Kathy Harms on Substack, or search Kathy Harms, you'll find it. We didn't come up with the name until afterwards, so the stories on Substack have different names, just working titles.
Yeah.
I've only just very quickly glanced at it, so this may be a really stupid question. I noticed that you've written it as, well, you say stories, they're like vignettes as you go along. And have you kept them chronological all the way through on both sides of the book?
Yeah, I did my best. There's a couple of places where it jumps ahead and then reflects back, but very briefly. I think there's a chapter like that in Mum's story as she's flying for the first time to Namu, and then she reflects back on the week before. But mostly I really tried to keep it chronological, so it is very much like, that's a great term for it, it's a series of vignettes in some cases, because you know, even as we're digging back for the connective tissue, it's still kind of story, like the things that stand out in memory, and you don't want to make something up to connect them more, so where there's not naturally something connecting, then it's a vignette. Yeah.
Well, that's really very realistic, because that is how people remember things. They don't remember the whole story in chronological order.
No,
Yeah,
no.
lovely.
No, there's lots of blanks in the memory world.
So we also have, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to offer you the invitation for any reflection. Kathy's brother is with us, Walter's son, and I'm just wondering if there's anything that struck you as they were going through this process, anything that you learned that was surprising.
Yeah, I would say a great amount of it was surprising. In the same way that Kathy's already mentioned, you know, there's sort of family hits where you have like the story that keeps coming up again and again, but very little about large tracts of their childhood. So that was pretty interesting stuff. And, you know, Dad's story, particularly from that side of it, was a completely different era in the province that I also grew up in, you know, so going to visit Dad's family in Kelowna for me was a 5-hour drive. And for Dad, going from, you know, Vancouver to Kelowna or from wherever he was in the province was sort of a Middle Earth style trek, you know, because it's hard to think of a province without all the highways and infrastructure and everything that we have. So it was kind of both a fascinating look at my parents' history, but then also the history of the province that is not that incredibly old. You know, it's pretty fresh. So those stories are kind of a good reflection of what life was like for kind of many people in the province at the same time. And then extending that back to, you know, my grandparents on both sides as well. Incredibly different pasts kind of coming together into our family. You know, Mom sort of being a small child as Liverpool was bombed in World War II. You know, and then also my grandparents on the other side making their way from Eastern Europe across to Canada for new opportunity and whatnot. And it's all not that long ago, you know, realistically. So it was pretty interesting to add a huge amount of context to that. So.
I do think that is fascinating. It's one of the things that struck me as well is that this is just a generation. One generation separates us from this life, right? And the way that life looked and how you navigated it and the things that were and were not available. And I mean, that's fascinating to me, how quickly that's changed. And I find this kind of writing really valuable to capture that, because I don't know how else it gets captured in these anecdotal, like the actual lived experiences of people who are only a generation away. It gives us a whole different understanding than, you know, reading the collective history of whatever is very different than understanding what it was like to be a bush pilot or what it was like to be a fly-in nurse in camp, you know, which is, how long ago was that? 40 years, 50 years?
Yeah, 50 years.
Yeah, one generation.
Hard to think. I think it's 60 years ago when I started flying. So, yeah, who expects to live that long?
Yeah. And have you been up recently? When's the last time you were up flying?
Oh, years ago. It's sort of something that you either do or you don't. It's quite addictive. And when you quit, you have to quit. You can't keep dabbling. It's you know, I have a neighbor and he built an airplane, home built, and he wanted me to rent it to fly. It was $30 an hour, which is not much money. But
You need to talk
A
louder.
little bit.
yeah, and he, I couldn't see that really. Well, for a couple of reasons. He took me up for a ride in it, and the window popped out. And so I thought the build quality might not be that high, but just flying around in circles doesn't really scratch the itch. Because when you're used to going somewhere, that's altogether different than just going up and flying around in circles. Like I never had the urge to fly aerobatics because you haven't gone anywhere and haven't done anything. So, but that's an individual thing. I mean, some people like that kind of thing. I mean, I like the sensation of being up there, but I also wanted to accomplish something while I was there.
Yeah, that
Well,
makes sense.
don't talk down those home-built aircraft, Dad, because was my first small aircraft flying experiences.
Yeah,
and
you also ended up having to walk home, so.
we flew down the lake and damaged the propeller landing, and so I got off onto the beach and waited for a ride home. Yeah, so, yeah.
Was that here?
Yeah, that was out towards Castle there. Fly one way, hitchhike the other way.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about this adventure, this journey that you all took together?
I don't know. It just reminds you that life is pretty good, and you don't want to get bogged down on stuff that's going on in the present necessarily, because the past has been good and we lived it. So, and we had a good time. And even though we didn't have all the bells and whistles that you have today, we were still very satisfied with how things were going. And so I thought I had a good life, and I still think that.
And I'd just say I'm grateful to my parents for putting their trust in me to capture your story.
Great. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. So Kathy's gonna be here for a little bit. Kathy and Walter are both gonna be here for a little bit. If you have a book you would like to sign or a question you want to
Okay, where's the book to buy to sign?
They're right up here.
Where?
Up here.
Right up here, up front
Well, that's
here.
yours.
Up here, up on the counter.
Yeah.
There,
Yeah.
okay.
Great, okay. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.